Hello, good morning to, or good afternoon, depending where you are located. I'm really happy to start this meeting. This is our second event in the Feminist Economic Recovery and Transformation series organized by IAFFE. And on behalf of IAFFE Online Event Committee, I would like to thank all of you for joining us today for this discussion. While we hope that the crisis will end soon, we are starting to think about how to include a feminist agenda in the plan for recovery. And this second event in our IAFFE webinar series focuses on African countries. I would like to thank the speakers of today's event, and I would like to introduce our moderator of today, that is Professor Abena Oduro. Abena is the director of the Marian Institute for Advanced Studies in Africa and associate professor in the Department of Economics, University of Ghana. Her main area of research are poverty and inequality analysis, gender and assets, unpaid care work, international trade policy, and WTO issues. She's a member of the board of directors and president-elect of IAFFE. I leave the floor to her.
Thank you very much, Erica. And so that we don't lose too much time, I am going to begin by introducing our speakers for this afternoon or this morning in the order that they will be presenting their papers. So our first speaker is Mary Kinyanjui, and she is a former senior research fellow at the Institute for Development Studies, University of Nairobi in Kenya. And as a career researcher at the Institute for Development Studies, she carried out research geared to informing policy on entrepreneurship, barriers to enterprise growth, gender relations in micro and small enterprises, innovation, enterprise clustering, and value chains in small enterprise. And in 2004, she began by focusing on archival research and case studies to determine the origin, entry, raison d'etre, relationships, learning formation of rules and regulations for governing self and deployment of surplus to examine why the mode survives in the 21st century. She has been involved in feminist activism in her writing and lived experiences, and she has published widely in international journals. And she writes opinions in the local dailies and for the World Bank Policy Institute Africa Angle blog. So this is our first presenter, Mary Kinyanjui. Our second presenter is Mike Rogan, and he is the interim director of WIEGO's Urban Policies Program and has been a research associate with the program since 2011. His current work centers on statistical analysis of earnings and status in employment in the informal economy, as well as issues around gender, tax justice, and urban regulation. Based at Rhodes University in South Africa, Mike is an associate professor in the Department of Economics and Economic History and the Neil Ajit Labor Studies Unit, known as NALSU. Our third presenter is Fatima Outaleb, and she's an advocate for women's human rights with a special focus on the responsive mechanisms and systems of survivors of gender-based violence. She is a member of the board of directors of Action Feminist, member of the group of experts of the North-South Council of Europe, and represents MENA on the board of the Global Network of Women's Shelters. She's on the steering committee of the Feminist Alliance for Rights and the ABAAD Advisory Board. So these are our three presenters for this afternoon, and I am going to hand over to Mary, our first presenter. Mary, you have 10 minutes to make your presentation.
Can we have the slides on? First, I wish to pass my regret and sorrow for those who have been affected by COVID-19, and also say, may they rest in peace, those who have died out of COVID-19. Next slide. The neoliberal economy was introduced through colonialism and entrenched during structural adjustment. I feel during this COVID-19, it is a time to rethink the neoliberal economy, which was introduced in Kenya during the colonial period. During that time, people are engaged in small-scale self-reliant activities, barter trade and all that. And as a women's response to the introduction of neoliberal economy, the women resisted on the grounds that when the neoliberal was introduced, husband and wife relationships were affected. The relationship between the mother and the son was affected. She lost her granary because of the introduction of new seeds. Her cow could not give milk, and she lost her identity and her self-reliance. So when the neoliberal economy was introduced, the women used to sing resistance songs about what they felt. And some of them, they explained their loss of self-reliance, the conflicts that ensued because of the introduction of money. Next slide. And when they were positioned in the neoliberal economy, the women are like the last colony. They are engaged in picking tea, picking coffee, working in horticulture production. Their children lost dignity. There was group labor and all that. So in this, when the women were introduced in the neoliberal economy, they were introduced in conditions that were poor, where they were involved in no-cadre jobs of picking tea, picking coffee, working on farm, and their children lost dignity. So it is for the next slide. Next slide. Next slide. So when the impact of COVID-19 happened, we find that we wrote a book, this book, COVID Stories from Eastern Africa, where people told their own stories about how they were reacting to COVID. And we also looked at the newspaper reports. One of the things that happened was the excessive borrowing, that Kenya borrowed like 250 billion Kenyan shillings from IMF to restore state-owned enterprise. It also borrowed to mitigate COVID-19. There was urban-rural migration. People were returning from the Nairobi to go to the rural areas to seek refuge. The neoliberal economy was shaken. There were jobs were not secure. Trade imbalance was revealed, and there was widespread use of technology. And this raises questions: how many avocados can a family sell to buy a laptop so as to maintain the technology? Or how many kilos of tea can a family sell to buy medicine? How many bananas can a family sell to buy laptop and airtime bundles to keep the children in school? All these things came into factor. How much cocoa or coffee beans can one sell to buy ventilators? These are things that are emerging in the economy. And then the drop in cash crop prices also. The importance of food production for community survival and flourishing. All these things came about into the open with COVID. Next slide. So what do we need to counteract the effect of COVID? We note that most of the African women, 80 to 70%, are involved in the informal economy or in small scale agriculture. And their boardroom is the fireside. So if we are to come out of the COVID situation, we have to address, to start with the fireside revolution at the bottom, whereby we shall change the way things are done in the economy. We shall look at different rules and regulations that will impact on Wanjiko. Wanjiko is the name given to women who are in popular politics, in informal economy, in peasant agriculture. This is where we really need a revolution to take place, so that COVID can be, so that we can have a new economy in COVID, an economy where there is equality, an economy where there is justice, an economy where there is solidarity. Next slide. So we find that Wanjiko being neglected, in order for her to benefit, one has to acquire a certain degree of modernity. And usually when we deal with gender, we are addressing corporation issues. We are addressing women in corporations and boardrooms. But how did we address the change in Wanjiko's fireside? Next slide. So the fireside feminist recovery, I see it as a space whereby there'll be a revolution of self-reliance. That is, jobs, people who are engaged in self-reliance will be acknowledged. People who are in self-help will be acknowledged. People who are doing odd jobs, which are often disregarded, they'll be given space and opportunity, and those jobs will be decriminalized. Those jobs will be given status, such as nannies and maids, and working on the farm. You find that when one is working on the farm in Africa, they tend to be despised as the low class, as the ones who could not get education. So we need a transformation at this far side to show that those who are in self-reliance, they are doing normal and proper job. We also need a space for sharing in the sense that you find that corporations will extract rather than share. They sacked people not just because of the one they feared loss of making profit. If we have relationships that are where people share profits, then the pain of the COVID would not have been felt as much. Space of solidarity, where people work in solidarity with each other, where they share, where they have reciprocal relationships. You scratch my back, I scratch your back. This is the kind of justice in the economy that we envision. Rethinking the restructuring of the money in the global economy. We need to think about the architecture and infrastructure of global finance. For example, when countries rely on loans throughout their life, how it is related to their lives. Rethinking global markets, food marketing, bananas, fruits, vegetables, multinationals trading in food. When food prices are kept low, the women at the fireside are kept, they suffer because they don't have adequate resources. So when global prices of food are kept low, the women in Africa at their fireside, they suffer. Rethinking cash crop like macadamia and avocados. How can we change this academia? How can we make this technology to benefit the people in the peasant economies? For example, if you look at a coffee making machine, the technology is left to the West, but in Africa, that there is no technology in picking coffee, there is no technology in farming. Can we have a Fireside Revolution that will bring in change? And then introduce self-reliance in food production for community survival. Food has come out to be very important, and we need to rethink how we produce food, because it's the only key thing that remained most important in the economy. How do we produce food? How do we market it? How do we distribute it? All these things come to mind as we think of the economy. Last slide. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you very much. And you've exactly 10 minutes. You completed in exactly 10 minutes. So thank you. So I'm going to ask for Mike Rogan to make his presentation.
Hi, can I just check that you can hear me okay before I start?
Yes,
Great. Well, thank you very much. And first of all, greetings from South Africa. And thank you very much for the invitation to be a part of this discussion. What I'll aim to do is just to give some brief examples of the gendered impacts of the COVID-19 crisis, and then reflect on what I think are some potential ways forward to address the challenges we've experienced in the past year, and perhaps pick up on a few of the points made by the previous speaker as well. Next slide, please. I think it's been fairly clear from the beginning of the crisis that there would be disproportionate impacts on both informal workers, which are the majority of workers in the world. 60% of the global workforce is informal. And that figure is, as indicated by the previous speaker, is much higher in sub-Saharan African countries, up to 80 and 90% in many countries. So of the 2 billion workers, the ILO warned us at the beginning of the pandemic that 1.6 of them were the most likely to be affected by the COVID-19 crisis. Projections were that upwards of 60% of earnings would be lost at the beginning of the crisis and throughout several phases of the pandemic, and that this went up to lost earnings in the informal economy in sub-Saharan Africa. The results is we know that poverty was likely to increase by upwards of anywhere between 20% and 80% in countries in the region. So the severity of the crisis, and particularly for informal workers, was well anticipated. And this translated to several statistics which have, I think, spurned governments into action. The first of which is that the impacts, particularly on informal workers, would be behind the loss of nearly 3 decades of progress in reducing poverty, setting back the global poverty agenda to the 1990s. And second, that this would be a particularly feminized crisis, in the sense that at the same time poverty levels have increased due to the loss of livelihoods, the gender gap in poverty was very likely to widen during this particular crisis. So these were some of the stylized expectations at the outset of the crisis. And as I'll show in the next few slides, this has largely, unfortunately, come to pass. Next slide, please. Globally, and this runs across the global north and the global south, this current pandemic recession has been described as a she-cession. Two of the things we know that explain the disproportionate gendered impacts of the crisis are the triple components of the crisis experienced by women. Women have borne the brunt of the losses of income and livelihoods. At the same time, they've seen a disproportionate increase in the demand for unpaid care work. And of course, women, just as men, are vulnerable to the health impacts of the crisis. So what's explained the particular gendered nature of this she-cession? Largely, it's been explained in the literature so far by the fact that the sectors in which women's work are concentrated have been disproportionately affected. So in the global north, this tends to largely feature employment in the retail and hospitality industries, which have been so badly affected. In the global south, sectors such as home-based work, where women work from their homes, making garments and other products, and various types of domestic work have been very badly affected by the crisis. Also, as the ILO had projected at the beginning of the crisis, informal employment in general and the informal sector in particular have been disproportionately affected. And these are areas where women's work is concentrated. So that's at least part of the reason for the gendered impact of the crisis. The other, of course, is the increase in the demand on women's time for unpaid care work, which we've seen play out in a number of different ways. Next slide, please. So because the focus today is on African countries, I'm going to present some data from 3 different sources. The first is the South African National Income Dynamics Study, the Coronavirus Rapid Mobile survey, which gives a sense of the scale of the impacts on South African households. The South African Quarterly Labor Force surveys give us a sense of the gendered nature of the impact on women's employment. And I'll also comment on a recent sort of data points collected from 12 cities around the world from the organization with which I work, WIEGO, where we've collected information on informal workers in 12 cities around the world, 4 of which are in Africa. South Africa, of course, being the country on the continent that's been the most severely impacted by the pandemic. Next slide, please. This is just a brief advertisement. If anyone's interested in the study that we're doing as we go, this is a link to the study site where you can see some of the findings. And just to note quickly that 4 of the 12 cities are based in Africa, which include Accra, Dakar, Durban, South Africa, and Dar es Salaam. Next slide, please. This is a brief snapshot of the initial impacts of the COVID-19 crisis on the South African labor market. What you can see here is the vast majority of the more than 2 million jobs that were lost at the outset of the crisis occurred in the informal economy. I'm sorry, the labels aren't visible to me at the moment. The bar on the far left is the rate of job loss in the informal economy. The middle is the formal economy, and on the right is total employment. So you can see the biggest bar there. The loss of the 29% decrease in jobs occurred in the informal economy. So much as the ILO projected, job losses were concentrated disproportionately among the informally employed in South Africa at the outset of the crisis. Next slide, please. This one's easier to read. The labels made it through. This is indicating the gender differences in job losses within the South African informal economy. So if you look to the left of the graph, the orange bars are women's employment in the informal sector, and the green bars are men's informal sector employment. So women's informal sector employment contracted by 29% compared with 23% of men's employment in the South African informal sector at the outset of the COVID-19 crisis. If we look at private households where both women and men work, where women are concentrated in domestic work and men tend to be concentrated in various types of landscaping, gardening, and informal maintenance activities, we can see a large gender difference in the loss of employment. There was a 23% drop in women's employment in this sector compared to only an 8% drop in men's employment. If we look at the South African economy, informal economy overall, we can see a slightly narrower gender difference, but still indication that women's employment was affected to a greater extent than men's, 31% versus about 28%. So again, I think these data are fairly representative of the ways that the informal economy has borne disproportionately the impact of job losses. And within that informal economy in the South African labor market, those job losses have been highly gendered. Next slide, please. This slide comes from the dedicated coronavirus rapid mobile survey of households in South Africa. This is focusing not on jobs lost, but on hours lost for those who didn't lose their jobs. So what it suggests is that amongst the informally employed in South Africa, the self-employed, which is the bulk of self-employment, these are own account workers, traders, many of the types of work that were described by the previous speaker. For those who didn't lose their jobs, who managed to do some type of work during the crisis, they still lost roughly just over half of their time in employment. So you can imagine the impact that that would have on earnings. This is particularly the case for the self-employed and various types of casual workers. So even though they didn't lose their jobs completely as a result of the crisis, they lost roughly half of their time in employment. This is particularly the case for women who lost overall about half of their time in the labor market, compared to only about 25% of men. So just another way of looking at it, showing the vast gender differences in the loss of livelihoods in the South African informal economy. Next slide, please. This set of statistics now comes from the WIEGO's global study, focusing on the 4 African cities. These are the percentages of women and men in informal employment that reported an increase in the burden of unpaid care work. Direct care, as is typically the case in the feminist literature, focuses on care of other human beings, children, the ill and elderly, while indirect care includes all other types of unpaid household work. And this is fairly reflective of what we found in a number of different contexts, which is women's increase in both direct and indirect care at the onset of the crisis was much larger than men's. And of course, as we're all probably aware, this was on top of already much higher levels of time spent in unpaid care work by women. So in other words, women, we can see at the outset of the crisis, women were really forced to balance their time in the labor market with a much larger demand in time spent on unpaid care work. Next slide, please. And this quote, I think, encapsulates very much what we found across the 12 cities. This quote comes from a woman we interviewed who recycles, is an informal recycler of waste in Dakar, Senegal. And she explains how, I think very tangibly, how she had to directly balance the ability to work and collect waste materials for money with the need to be home for children who aren't at school, and balancing also the health risks, the sense that if she becomes ill herself, there would be no one to take care of her household members. We found this to be very representative of the experiences from the women we interviewed in the 12 cities around the world. Next slide, please. And this is the final slide in terms of the data sources I mentioned earlier. These are 3 of the cities from WIEGO's 12-city study, and this shows how these increased burdens of unpaid care work and the loss in livelihoods due to the pandemic have impacted on women's and men's earnings differently. So the bars denote the percentage of earnings in the middle of 2020 and during the April lockdown period for women and men respectively. So what we can see in each city, the 2 bars on the left are for women under each city category, and the 2 bars on the right are for men. And what we see in more or less all cities is that women's income dropped more dramatically at the onset of the crisis in April, and were much slower to recover by mid-year. So women's incomes were impacted more directly by the crisis, and also were much slower to recover. So if we look at the example of Dakar, for example, both women's and men's incomes were half or less than half of their pre-COVID earnings in April. But by the middle of the year, men's earnings had recovered to almost 60% of their pre-COVID levels, but still hovered around just over 50% for women. And this is a pattern we saw across the 12 cities, but was particularly marked in the African cities, which we included in our sample. Last slide, please. So I guess I'd leave on a reflection of what this means and what we can do. Many of the ideas are similar to the previous speaker, and perhaps we can pick this up in the question and answer and discussion period. Many of the ways we think about mitigating the impacts and the gendered nature of those impacts are fairly straightforward, but perhaps have particular relevance in response to COVID-19. We know that women in the informal economy make up the bulk of employment and women's employment in many countries, yet their contributions are not recognized. Many of them are already doing things such as making masks and other forms of personal protective equipment, but receive no supports in doing so. A simple solution or a reflection on a way forward would be to ensure that government procures goods and services from these informal workers, many of which are in disguised dependent contractor relationships with large global firms. As indicated by the previous speaker, regulating access to and ensuring the right to work in public spaces would go a long ways to mitigating the negative impacts on many types of informal workers, but women in particular. In the time of a crisis, when so many jobs are lost, particularly those by women in the informal economy, it's an opportune moment to think slightly outside of the box and to think through things such as employment guarantee schemes, which many countries have been thinking about in the past, but perhaps now is a time to implement more seriously these types of measures. Many types of basic infrastructure services near the places and public spaces where informal workers are employed have been calls and platforms for actions for many years, but the urgency of this particular crisis is perhaps a time to act on these demands, as well as the provision of affordable and accessible childcare facilities near places of informal employment. Again, a call that's been made for many years by organizations of informal workers, but which would demonstrably address the current crisis. And then finally, many types of public works and upgrading of infrastructure, administrative support for public agencies, schools, health facilities, and green services would go a long way toward supporting informal workers. Again, many of whom are the vast majority of the labor markets in the countries of sub-Saharan Africa. I think I'm probably out of time, but it would be great to pick up on some of these suggestions or reflections later in the webinar. So thanks for your time, and I look forward to the discussions.
Thank you, Mike. So we will ask our final presenter, Fatima.
Yeah, hello. Just one second to share my slide. Yeah, so good afternoon, everybody from Rabat, Morocco. Thank you, all of you, those who invited me, who thought of me, and happy to share with you our experience. I mean, the experience of women human rights defenders and service providers in Morocco, the Maghreb, but also in MENA region. Bless all those who died, who the victims of COVID, and also those who died recently in circumstances, very difficult circumstances, like the one I will be sharing with you now. So I'm not an academic, and I'm not going to talk deeply like my predecessors on the current situation in Morocco and the Maghreb and the MENA region. They all look alike. We belong to the global south, and most of what my friends have just talked about and shared is not different from what we have lived before, during the crisis, and maybe for years to come. because the same regimes, the same policies, gender-blinded policies, and the same impunity, corruption, which has really become terrible phenomenon in our countries. So my title is Crises Bring Out the Best and the Worst in Humanity. I will start with the worst. Unfortunately, yesterday, just to give you an example of how women are always exploited in stable settings as well as in unstable situations. So since the outbreak of COVID, for example, in Morocco, there were many accidents, many terrible stories about women being either contaminated by the virus or even dead, as what happens yesterday. So yesterday, at least 28 women died in a flooded house that was being used as a clandestine textile factory in the north of Morocco. The victims, most of which were women, were trapped, of course, in the basement of the house. Residential, and it's a residential, very rich neighborhood, and the owner, I put on in bold the look at how the media and the authorities are trying already to prepare for impunity. The owner of the factory, they said that he is now under medical supervision, which really means that he won't pay the price for the losses of all those innocent women. So of course, we are under COVID, locked, and the impact of COVID and the lockdown on women's economic and social lives is terrible. We all know that. Now the question, what's the question after one year? So I will also be talking about how policy makers have not thought a single have done nothing at the beginning when they were starting to design policies to handle the pandemic. They did not think about women in informal sectors. They did not think about women breadwinners. They allocated financial aids for men, even if the woman in that house is the one who is working, not the man. And everything they have designed was in a male perception. And if women, human rights defenders, service providers did not make the first step to go and check on women who were locked and who are locked because of the curfew with the perpetrators, they would not know the scale of violence, of gender-based violence occurring in locked places, and they would not hear of women suffering from the economic policy, which really excluded women, knowing that for years, we have been trying to highlight, to raise the policymakers' awareness regarding the situation, the fragile situation where women in informal sectors, women domestic workers. In Morocco, for example, we have laws. We have a law on for domestic workers, which is supposed to guarantee domestic workers' rights, which it has never been implemented, and no one is doing anything. That's why I wanted to talk a little bit about how our role as service providers, as human rights defenders, is really to pressure. But all of us, you belong to the academy, you have the know-how, you have the data, you have the ability to make researches, and I think we have the proximity work. We have the chance to see what's going on, the impact of what you are doing. And maybe now one of my calls is really for us, all the stakeholders, it's time, I think, now to see how we can work together in order really to make this data, the data you have prepared and you have worked on, really available to us and also useful in what we are doing on a daily work, and also in our lobbying and advocacy work and campaigns we are doing for things to change, for those policymakers to know that women are suffering and women are paying the price, unfortunately, and we have all seen how women have paid the price in this pandemic. So I said that CEOs and service providers were the ones to flag inequalities and discriminations. And I will share with you some of the discriminations we have flagged. For example, the crisis has widened pre-existing gender gaps in pay, in pay and in leadership. Girls in rural areas have no access to remote education because, as you know, with the pandemic, everybody's locked in at home, and the Ministry of Education in Morocco and Tunisia, Algeria, they have changed the system in a way that people and the students benefit from online courses. Unfortunately, half of students did not have the chance to have that remote education. Poverty also, it hindered their access to tech-based education. Parents illiterate, they could not really help their children having that proper education at home because they don't know how to write and how to read. They are unable to help their children. Women in informal sectors, of course, they were not compensated. There were compensations for people, for example, who have the security, social security. Those who were in informal sectors, they did not have that chance. So this is really heartbreaking when you see that women are struggling really to bring food on table because policymakers, they are not. It's simply they are not citizens. They are not considered as full citizens who participate in the welfare of the state, and that's why they did not think that there were women who used to work in streets, who used to have their own jobs outside their homes, and now they are just forced to be locked down in their homes, and they have nothing from the government, nothing to survive. So there are a lot of very sad stories. So women, as I said, just some figures. The average rate of female labor force participation in the Maghreb and the Arab countries in MENA region, for example, stands at 20%. The region has had the widest gender gap in entrepreneurial activity, social norms. Here also the social norms, they have contributed in a way to hinder the social welfare and the economic welfare of women. So social norms and legal framework continues to constrain women's access to economic opportunities, despite the fact that women are outnumbering men in universities. Here, as you can see, it's I wanted to show how it is important for women from the global south to partner with women from the global, and how solidarity among women human rights defenders is important. Here, I'm giving you an example of Feminist Alliance for Rights, which has coordinated a global statement which was endorsed by 1,700 individuals and organizations calling government to adopt feminist policy to address the crisis, flagging key areas and recommendations, top of which economic and social inequalities. So many organizations in my region, they have endorsed the statement and adapted accordingly with the reality of their countries. So other recommendations coming from Arab states and civil society organizations, feminist network I belong to. Very quickly I will go through some of the recommendations, like it's a really high time we look into the future towards potential opportunities among women. We need sustained investment in gender responsive social protection and care systems. And you all know how it is, how there is a gap in the social protection in Morocco, whether it's in Morocco or any other country of the Maghreb or the MENA region. Women, they constitute 50% of the population, but most of women are working in informal sectors, and they don't have that social security which really protects them from crises like for example the pandemic, the COVID pandemic. So women needs at the center, should be at the center of socio-economic responses. We need extended assistance to our informal economy, and we also need rethink women's role in the economy and society. It's true that economic recovery fully depends on leverage of the potential of both men and women, but yet women are the ones who are paying the price. Women are the most vulnerable categories of population, which really is paying. And the first example I gave you about those who died in that locked basement really showed how harsh is women's reality. So that's why we need sustaining and scaling the extension of social protection. As I said, we need to adopt gender-sensitive policies and insights from feminist economics. Yes, we need more insights from people like you, but we also need joint work, collaborative work of all stakeholders, whether they are practitioners, practitioners, human rights defenders, or academics. We need really to bridge that gap between us and start really doing work on the ground, and trying to fill that gap, but also trying to put into practice all the ideas you have come up with. I didn't want to focus more on giving statistics. I knew that you will be doing that. I knew that what my friend Mary has talked about in her country is really the same as what is happening in Morocco. So now, what is the solution? How can we together join our work and make women's life better, make the system be more gender responsive, more gender sensitive, and how can everybody really benefits from the welfare of our our land? How can anyone profit from what our lands offer, what is possible, the possibilities which are offered in our respective countries, and not be left behind or excluded, as it is the case now for millions of women and girls in our region. I'm sorry if maybe I went out of time, no?
A few minutes, but that's okay.
Thank you, sorry.
No problem. Thank you very much. So I'd like to say thank you to Mike, Mary, and Fatima for their presentations. And just a couple of observations from the three presentations that have been made. In all three presentations, the focus is women in the informal economy. And indeed, it is pertinent because although I'd like to ask the question of Mike, the informal economy is large in countries such as Kenya and in countries such as mine, Ghana, where the informal sector comprises about 70 to 90% of the total economy. So it is pertinent to focus on women in the informal economy. But what I also find interesting looking at the three presentations is that we also get different aspects of women. So we have women, and that is the point that Mary makes, that when we are designing policies, it's almost as if we are designing policies and thinking of women only in the formal sector, so that we are leaving out women in the informal sector. And then you have the point that is being made by Fatima, where in the Maghreb region, you only have labor force participation of 20%. So it means that a large sector of women are not in employment, but we need to care about them during this crisis. And in particular, one dimension that she raises is this issue of domestic violence that all women experience, but especially women, you could say, who are confined at home for long periods because they are not able to go out and work. They may be particularly vulnerable. I would like to ask Mary, and this is a question that was up in the chat. She talks about the fireside and the Fireside Revolution. So Mary, could you tell us a little bit more in terms of this concept of the fireside? Can you elaborate a little bit more on it?
The fireside is the space of women in the informal economy, women in peasant agriculture, women fisherfolk. The fireside is the space of consumption. The fireside is the space where the woman brings everything that she has earned from the farm, from the factory, from the market, from the field, from the lakeside, and she prepares it and makes it space for consumption. So it's both her organizing space, it's the space that she plans from, it's the space that she lives in. If you consider most of our housing in rural areas, the fireside is the space where the woman organizes from. It's the space that she reproduces from. It's the space that she makes production. So when I see a fireside revolution, I want to see a revolution like the one that was introduced when Neoliberal economy was introduced and everything was upset in her household. So if we are going to begin by addressing the fireside of these women, that's the beginning where I want to see the revolution of self-reliance, the revolution of solidarity, the revolution of reciprocal relationships. So in this case, the fireside is the space where I use the concept as the space where the woman organizes herself, the woman who is not in the boardroom, the woman who is not in the corporation. How does he organize? She organizes at the fireside. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mike, is there something you would want to, from your perspective, Mike and Fatima, this concept of the fireside?
Yeah, I mean, I've not looked at it specifically as a fireside, but I think it's a fairly apt metaphor. It speaks also to multiple sites of production, as well as the multiple role of women in households and in labor markets. I think the point I would add to this particular discussion is that diversity of informal economies, both across countries and within countries. We often see them as homogenous sections of the labor market that are excluded from formal employment, but they're incredibly diverse. And in many contexts, they tend to be highly gendered. And I would just add to the point that many of these, in particular, the gendered vulnerabilities of informal labor markets were relatively well established before this crisis. But certainly they've been exacerbated by the crisis and tend to really highlight the way some of these inequalities come to the fore in such a crucial moment and, across the world. So I think it's important for a group like this to remember that these aren't new issues, but they're being exacerbated and highlighted in slightly new ways by this unprecedented situation. So, I think in that regard, the idea of the fireside is a fairly useful lens.
Fatima, would you like to make a contribution to this?
Yeah, as Mike has just said, nothing is new. It has just been, the crisis has just exacerbated, enhanced the situation, the fragile situation of women. And I think for example, how can I say, in our countries where policymakers are undermining all the work we are doing, where social norms are very powerful, where every single step we take, for example, to advance women's rights, it's always interpreted in a way that really hinders that work, and in a way that it's been adopted by populations, by the social media, and that really did not make and does not make our work easy. Now I think what is new with this pandemic is that it's policymakers are because it's worldwide, it's general, it's common to all, and there are other areas, countries, continents which are talking the same and suffering, facing the same situations, but addressing it in different ways. That it's only that time that they try to either to comply with for example, the UN General Secretary first speech, but also trying to recognize that what we were saying for years, what we were highlighting, that women are suffering in informal sectors, that we don't have gender policy which really protects women's rights. We don't have labor codes which guarantee those, and they are not implemented. And now I think, as I said, this crisis has brought worse and very bad things, but it has also brought, I don't want to say positive, but at least opportunities where such discriminations, exclusions, gender-blind policies are highlighted and flagged.
Thank you. You raised the point about differences in the different ways in which the pandemic, countries have responded to the pandemic. And indeed, that was a thought that crossed my mind when I was trying to understand the slide that was put up by Mike, where you have the earnings, what had happened to earnings in April, and then what happened mid-year. You have it for Accra, Dakar, and Durban, if I remember rightly. And you find that the experiences are quite different. Would you say it's because one of the reasons is the different responses that countries have, the different ways in which they've responded to the pandemic? Mike.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are some important opportunities to address the crisis, particularly with a gendered lens. I think it has to be multifaceted. There's no single intervention, and certainly social protection is something that that comes up in most conversations, whether it's about gender or otherwise. Perhaps one sort of common strand across countries is that the epidemic in the North and the South really showed the holes we have in our social security and social protection systems. And informal workers in some contexts, but not all, fall through these holes quite easily. In some contexts, it's a lack of comprehensive social protection and safety nets. But in other contexts, informal workers, and including women, form something along the lines of a missing middle. They're not poor enough to fall into the cash grants, social protection or social relief measures, but they're not integrated into formal uninsured, for example, unemployment insurance programs. So they're left without any sort of social net, and it's a crisis like this that exacerbates that lack of comprehensive social protection. But I think that's only part of the intervention. And as I mentioned earlier, many of these gendered inequalities, which we're speaking about today, are pre-existing and require, I think, more nuanced thinking about labor markets. Perhaps one of the positive things to come out of the crisis is the attention on the informal economy. In the North, it's been the focus on the movement towards the gig economy and how that's left workers stranded without any recourse during the crisis. Of course, in the South, we don't see this as a new phenomenon, since the vast majority of our labor markets are informal. But I think what we're seeing as the years unfolded and the crisis has moved from one of government intervention on restrictions and curfews to more of an economic crisis where the rebuilding of supply chains has largely missed those at the bottom of the economic pyramid. So perhaps it's time to ask some questions on how we rebuild supply chains and we rebuild economies from below, which is where the majority of workers globally are, and in the countries in which we're speaking about today, and many of us are based, it's the vast majority of the workforce. So how do we rebuild these economies? How do we reconnect these markets in a way that includes the majority of workers, which are very much outside of the formal institutions of the formal sections of the labor market? And I hope this crisis presents an opportunity. Someone used the term build back better. Another way to look at it is, how do we get a new, better deal for informal workers moving forward? The crisis has shown us that the way we've been operating to date has probably not been sustainable with the majority of the workforce at such risk.
I'd like to open up the floor now. I see that there are lots of comments in the chat box. And so would members of the audience, I think if you have a question, you're supposed to type it in. We've looked at the issue about the fireside, where I have a comment here. I see the fireside presented by Mary as, and we quote, the space of the reproduction described by Pichio and other feminist economists. So if we have any questions that we would like to ask, please put them in the chat box. But there's, in the discussions raised by Fatima, you mentioned gendered social protection. Would you like to expound on that a little bit?
Yeah, gendered protection, or let's say gender policy, when it comes to protection. I don't know if you know the situation in Morocco. If you are working an informal sector, self-employed, or you don't benefit from any social protection whatsoever. There is a program now which was launched last year by the King to expand social protection to men and women in informal sectors. But what happens is, because women are not considered as breadwinners in the mindset of men, those even who are in charge of implementing, for example, that law or that policy to include everybody in the social protection, women, they really struggle to convince, to prove that they are the ones who work. And they are the ones who bring food to the table. Men even if they don't work, they don't participate, and also because of the law. This is how it is made. The family law, for example, the legal guardianship goes to the man. The man is the one in charge of anything related to legal matters of children. And if there is any compensation from the government, it goes to the man, even if the man is, the couple is divorced. So that's why there is the mindset which does not recognize women as really breadwinners and head of families, but also there is corruption. There is corruption, which and it's the social norms, the cultural heritage, which really does not want to recognize the role of women in the economic infrastructure. That is, I think, the main obstacle hindering the social protection. For example, women who are victims of gender-based violence, who are beaten, I mean, who have to go to leave the house. The state has no infrastructure to protect those women. We don't have shelters. All the shelters operating, not even operating. I was running a shelter for years. During the pandemic, we closed because the policymakers, they don't believe that what we are doing is important, that you are offering protection to women. So they don't invest in shelters, and they don't invest in any social whatsoever protection regarding women, because of this, as I said, because of the social norms which they exclude without even questioning whether it's that woman is divorced or what. They don't, and there are exceptions. I just saw on a comment, somebody said that how come that we heard from the officials that Morocco has managed to have its cities safe. But what you are saying, Fatima, is that goes against what we heard. I am free, and I have no obedience to anyone, no allegiance to anyone. I am a human rights defender. This is the reality as I see it. I see that our cities are not safe, and the worst example is yesterday's example. Women being locked in the basement, being exploited by someone, by a man who will not be judged, who will not be punished because of the system. This is the system. It doesn't protect those women who were obliged, forced to go to that basement and work because they can't provide that to their children. That's the gap of the social protection which does not exist and which leads to the death of 28 women today, and yesterday others had to pay the price. So it's the whole system, which should be really changed.
Thank you. There's a question that has been posed to Fatima, but I'm going to direct it to Mary because of the comments that Mary made. Because Mary, you mentioned rethinking women's role in the economy and society. And the question that was posed to Fatima was, how do we change the mindset which does not recognize the economic and social contribution of women? But I'm going to sort of pose the question to Mary first, and then Fatima can come in if she wants to. Rethinking, so probably not just rethinking it, but also recognizing. How do you think we can bring about that change?
I see this conference being a beginning point for rethinking women's role. If we bring issues in conferences like this, where we bring people all together from the world to discuss issues of the economy, it's a beginning point. So associations like the Feminist Association is a beginning point of rethinking. Then we transfer this to our education system, the way we teach, the way we write books. We need to now start thinking what kind of books are we writing and how do we write them? If we think about rethinking the economy, are we going to write about women peasants, women in the informal economy books? And if we write these books, how are they going to reach the audience? Then the next place we bring our rethinking is in the classrooms. How do we teach women in the informal economy? How do we teach courses on women peasants, traders, and artisans? These are the things that we need to bring to our classrooms. Then we need to move further in rethinking in the UN. It's high time that the UN also rethought its own policies. How has it been seeing people in the informal economy for so long? Is it the same way that Hart visualized it in the 1970s? Has the informal economy changed? What is it? What is new in the understanding of the new economy? For example, there is a Journal of Africa which has a special issue on hustling. We need to see what is the new knowledge coming out of Africa. For example, I have been writing about the informal economy, saying that these people are not on a book, they are not on a dress rehearsal. They are actually living and making a living. Can we bring this new knowledge to the fore? And as I said, a feminist organization like IAFFE is a beginning point of rethinking. And then we need to take it to policy level. We need to tell the world that it's high time that the world came together like they did after the Second World War and renegotiated the global economy again, because some of the things that we are seeing, they are so systematic, they are so entrenched, and unless we think them at that level, where we shall think about why should money be controlled from one source? Why should the trade be controlled from one source? We need to bring this to the policy level, classroom level, book writing level, stories like, like these individual stories that we have written in this book. We need to write stories, more stories about people, more stories about people in the informal economy and how they are behaving. Thank you.
I can't hear you. Abena?
I muted myself because I had sound. I'm sorry. I said I saw that you were nodding your head as Mary spoke. So if you want to add, because we are coming towards the end of the seminar, the webinar, if you want to add a couple of sentences.
Yeah, I totally agree with Mary. We have to rethink also our way of handling issues we are all caring about and striving for women's rights and gender equality. And here, when I was preparing for this webinar, it came to my mind, I knew that there will be academics talking about giving data and talking about the situation with figures and but I also wanted to share my experience as a field worker and say how important it is for us as a community, because I see ourselves as one community, whether it's the academics, whether it's practitioners, human rights defenders, advocates, lobbyists, media. We need to acknowledge the role and recognize the role of each one of us. And when I try to flag the service providers and advocacy campaigners or defenders, human rights defenders, because there is an ongoing conversation in the at least in the Arab region. I know best and better about the role of service providers. They always try to undermine the role of service providers and say that our role is to advocate for changing laws and this and that, and the service provision is the role of the government. It's the state responsibility to protect women. It's the state's responsibility to go to the streets and see and work with women in informal sectors, etc. But COVID has just highlighted how service provision is important, how proximity work has allowed for realities, terrible realities to be brought into view. How we knew that women were locked, were beaten in locked places. How we knew that women were dying out of famine because the government policy excluded them. So that's why I think it's very important, if we really want to make useful what you are doing in universities, writing books, etc., and what we are doing to recognize each other. Each one of us is very important. Our role are crucial to making change happen, whether it's for the economic and social welfare of women, of legal rights, etc., etc. And that's what I wanted to say, and that's why I was nodding my head when Mary was talking and showing the book she wrote. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to, I would say, give the last word to Mike. You on this whole issue about trying to bring about change. We're concerned about attitudes. We are concerned about the role of women and not considering indeed the gender dimensions of policies as they are being designed and implemented.
Yeah, well, this is an unexpected honor to have the last word. I'm not quite sure what I did to deserve this, but thank you. You know, I think what I would add, there's a comment that I've just spotted in the chat now. Economic policy making must recognize the role of informal work and unpaid care work. You know, and I think that's really at the heart of what organizations like this believe and strive to show. And I think there are lots of different ways of doing that. And one of the things that sort of I think was important that was mentioned earlier is that many of our social protection systems in varying degrees across different countries are based on the male breadwinner model. That's been a particular concern of feminist economists for decades. But in the same way, many of the ways that we approach informal employment are based very much on the standard employment employer-employee model. And that's not a model. Policies based on that are not based on a model that works for the majority of informal workers and women in particular across the developing world. So just as policies based on a male breadwinner model are not a good reflection of the reality, policies which seek to define the employer-employee relationship don't make a lot of sense for the self-employed. And I think we can point to some victories along the way. So for example, the ILO now recognizes the category of dependent contractor, which largely applies to women as home-based workers in many countries on the subcontinent. And it demonstrates, or it highlights and makes more visible the role of women who are not really self-employed, but depend in large part on the supply chains in which their employment is inserted. So I think our role is to challenge the traditional framework. It's not always easy because the models are based on male employment and a standard relationship with an employer and employee, which aren't that applicable, particularly in the countries we're talking about today. So I think it's a gradual process, and I agree with the other speakers that it's organizations like these, it's scholars and activists that understand these nuances of the way the system fundamentally needs to be renegotiated. And I think what's piqued our interest in today's topic is perhaps a crisis that's so unprecedented, like the one that we're in now is an opportunity to reframe the way employment and unpaid cared work are positioned and appreciated as crucial parts of society. And hopefully this crisis, if it's taught us anything, is we can't carry on the way we were before. And it's an opportunity to not go back to the way things were before, but to make a giant leap in this moment, potentially of a moment of rebuilding. Of course, that's an optimistic position, and there are plenty of opposing views that would like us to get back to some idealized place in the past. But if there's enough momentum, perhaps the optimistic approach will win out in the end. And that would be my hope for where we are now in this particular moment. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Fatima. Thank you, Mary. And in terms of a closing comment for me, I would actually like to refer to something in the chat box, which has been written by Nancy Kachingwe. And towards the end, she says that what COVID has shown is that women are the safety net. And indeed, work that has been done by researchers published in Feminist Economics shows that when there are shocks as households adjust, you find that the adjustment falls on women and women's unpaid work. So those are important points that have been raised in the chat box and also raised by our speakers. So at this point, I would like to say thank you to our presenters. Thank you very much for accepting the invitation. And I would like to say to the participants, thank you, especially for those of you who are with us to the very end. Thank you very much for all who have joined us today. I would like to hand over to Erica, who has some more information for us.
Thank you very much, Abena, and thank you very much to the panelists for this very interesting webinar. I wanted to ask some questions, but I saw that the chat was so lively, and so I kept them for myself and allowed the others to ask. I didn't want to take advantage. So before we close, I would like to remind all the participants that we will have another IAFFE event on the 4th of March. And this is going to be about the special issue of feminist economics on COVID-19. And we will have the editors of the special issue speaking about it. And one last thing that I would like to say before we close is that in this webinar series about recoveries, feminist economic recovery post-COVID-19, we would like to have a vision also about other parts of the world. So everybody is welcome to contact IAFFE or to contact the online events committee and with proposal about organizing next events of this series with a different focus. So we want to discuss about all the different realities that people and especially women are experiencing in different parts of the world. Thank you very much, everybody, for being with us today.